Hello, everybody. Welcome. Our guests are being interviewed right now, and so they're on their way. But I just wanted to welcome you, and my name's Ben Cook. I'm a professor at the law school, and I'm also director of the Center for Conflict Resolution here at BYU. The Center for Conflict Resolution is located here in the Wilkinson Center, and we are here to help promote peace, and we do that in a variety of ways. We also have partnered with this event with the Village Square, and Jacob Hess, are you here? Jacob, do you want to say a little bit about what Village Square does before we move on to the next thing?
Yes, I apologize. They are just taking a bathroom break, and they'll be here any minute. If it wasn't NPR, we would be frustrated with them. So the Village Square is aimed at bringing liberals and conservatives together to see each other as human beings. We basically trick Republicans and Democrats to get in the same room, and then we have a party. That's our model. And we've done events on immigration, climate change, gay marriage, everything you can imagine that human beings disagree about, we've done events on. And the outcome is always the same. If you actually get people eating food together and listening and talking and laughing together, all of a sudden they realize that their political opposite is not the devil or Hitler. And it really always, always happens. You would think that in our current political climate, the interest in this kind of a thing is growing. It's actually decreasing. We're seeing plenty of evidence that people are less and less and less and less interested in this. So we're really grateful that you're here today among those who are. These two congressmen have been touring universities across the country. You can come in, gentlemen, and just got back from Berkeley and Pepperdine. Come on up to the front. And they hail from Florida, survived the hurricane. We're really grateful to have all of them here today. I wanted to add one thing, that tonight at the Provo City Library, there is another dialogue event on the opioid epidemic. If you have any interest, it starts at 7 at the Provo City Library. It's free. There's refreshments. And my colleague, Becca Curl, leads that. If you're interested in that, would like to join that dialogue, please come to the Provo City Library tonight. So thanks to Ben and BYU for hosting us today.
Okay, while they're getting ready, I'll go ahead and welcome you to the Center for Conflict Resolution's event, Why Gridlock Rules Washington, featuring Evan McMullen, David Jolly, and Patrick Murphy, two former members of Congress. My name is Andrew Evans. I'm a caseworker at the Center for Conflict Resolution, and many thanks to the Village Square for scheduling our speakers today. And thank you for joining the Center for Conflict Resolution in our mission to build peacemaking leaders and to transform conflict. In a moment, we'll have Stephanie Aldis, a second-year law student from Studio City, California, give us our opening prayer.
Heavenly Father, we're grateful for the opportunity we have to meet together at this university and to learn about civil discourse. Please bless that thy Spirit will be with us to enlighten our minds. Please inspire us and give us the strength to change and to invite change. We pray for these things humbly in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Stephanie. The mission of the Center for Conflict Resolution is to transform conflict and build peacemaking leaders. That's why we've invited our guests today, Evan McMullen, David Jolly, and Patrick Murphy, to teach us how to transform conflict in the political world. Introducing Evan McMullen, he's the co-founder of Stand Up Republic, an organization promoting democratic ideals, norms, and institutions in America. Previously, Evan was an independent candidate for president in the 2016 election. Before launching his campaign, he was the chief policy director for the House Republican Conference, where he led a team of advisors covering all matters of domestic and foreign policy. Evan also served as a senior advisor to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he was responsible for conducting oversight of U.S. foreign policy related to North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and national security while advising members of Congress on those issues. Prior to his work in the House, Evan was an investment banker with Goldman Sachs in San Francisco, working with companies in a range of industries on various strategic and capital-raising projects. Evan started his career at the Central Intelligence Agency's National Clandestine Service as an operations officer, managing traditional and counterterrorism operations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. He studied international studies at Brigham Young University and earned an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania.
All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. It's such a pleasure to be back on campus. I'm always happy to be here and frustrated that my camera won't actually capture the beauty of campus and the surrounding mountains. But I'm happy to be here nonetheless, and thrilled to be here with our two esteemed guests, Patrick Murphy and David Jolly. I want to thank, before we get started, the various organizations who helped this happen. The J. Reuben Clark Law School, the Center for Conflict Resolution, BYU generally, the Village Square, and for all of the people who here on campus worked to set up the logistics and whatnot. This is an important conversation, I think, to have at this particular moment with these particular leaders. I've been, over the last year or so, especially concerned by the growing polarization in our country. And if any of you have heard me talk before in the past year, you probably heard me mention this Pew Research that shows both parties moving towards extremes, the Republicans moving to the far right, the Democratic Party moving to the left, and leaving open this space in the middle where still tens of millions of Americans exist. But the reality is that the polarization of these two parties, of our two major parties, not everyone in those parties, but the parties collectively, results in the failure of our leaders in Washington to address modern challenges, a variety of challenges that we face in modern times. And that dysfunction, or that gridlock, though, I think has now moved into a new phase of dysfunction, and even beyond that, to a space of chaos and even violence. And I think this conversation is particularly relevant now, given the events of yesterday and the shooting of that congressional Republican baseball practice last year. These events really underscore the importance of addressing this issue of polarization, political polarization in the country, and resulting gridlock and dysfunction. And if we weren't convinced of the need previously, certainly these attempted bombings over the last couple of days, and again that shooting, should lead us to a place of, I think, reflection and self-reflection, reflection as a country. And it's that kind of thinking that Patrick Murphy and David Jolly have done a lot of in their political careers and since their time in Congress. And so it's such an honor to have them here. And before we get started, I have the pleasure of introducing them. I'll start with Patrick Murphy, who represented Florida's 18th district. That's the Treasure Coast and Northern Palm Beach County areas. He was in office from 2013 to 2017. He's a CPA and a businessman. He grew frustrated with the dysfunction that he saw in Washington and ultimately decided to challenge an incumbent in his district who was moving further to the right, a Republican. And 2 years later, even though he won that race in a close race, 2 years later he won re-election by 20 percentage points, which is quite an achievement in a competitive district. Murphy's key accomplishments include a variety of efforts and leadership to protect the environment. He also introduced acts to save billions of wasteful spending at the federal government level. He was one of the first millennials elected to Congress. And I don't know if you're still millennials, maybe not. So at the time it was a big deal. And he formed groups inside Congress, caucuses of Republicans and Democrats to work together and find solutions. And since then Well, while in Congress, he served on the Financial Services Committee. He was on the Intelligence Committee. He gained a reputation as a problem solver, a unifier. And since then, he was named to the chair of the Future Forum Foundation, a nonprofit working to address economic challenges. And he's a visiting fellow at the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service. So please join me in welcoming Patrick Murphy here. Thank you. David Jolly served in the House of Representatives from 2014 to 2017, representing Florida's 13th congressional district. He, before that, and some of you will be interested to know this, held about every role you can imagine in the House of Representatives, starting with intern.
That's right.
David was a proud intern.
It was a much more enjoyable job being an intern than a member.
Exactly. So for those of you who may be getting started similarly, this can be the outcome. Greater opportunity for leadership. Since then, David has, he's an attorney, he's a political consultant. You've probably seen both Patrick and David on television offering their analysis of recent events. I'll note that David Jolly is also a board member of my organization, Stand Up Republic, which we're grateful for. David Jolly was elected in a special election in 2014, but then won re-election with, I think, 75% of the vote, right? So, these are two men who have proven that unifying leadership can find success in districts, especially competitive districts. But David won his races in a district that President Obama, as a Republican, won his races in a district President Obama had won twice. And he later became, after having gone through some of the most expensive campaigns in the history of the House of Representatives, then became a fierce campaign finance advocate, introduced the STOP Act, which would have prohibited members of Congress from soliciting donations for themselves. In Congress, David fought alongside his fellow Republicans for balanced budgets, tax reforms, veterans' health care freedom, school choice, while trying to build consensus with his colleagues on the other side of the aisle. He also broke with his party at times, as has Patrick, and became an early advocate for LGBTQ protections. He pushed his party to accept the science of climate change and became a proponent of comprehensive immigration reform. So these are two independently minded leaders in our country who have served on opposing sides of the aisle, but who have found common ground and actually generated and advanced solutions for the country. And so with that, again, let's welcome our guest. Welcome David Jolly.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll now turn the time over to both of you. Patrick, why don't you start, and we'll give you time to make remarks, and then we'll hand it to David.
Sounds good. We usually flip a coin to see who goes first, so
We forgot to do that.
I'll take it. Thank you for hosting us, Evan. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your leadership too on so many important issues, and for all of you for taking the time. We look forward, really first and foremost, to your questions. That's like the fun part to us, is to really hear what's on your mind. And David and I have been on this tour for about a year now, talking to folks about why DC is so broken. Because that was probably the single biggest question that we got while we were in office, is what's wrong with you all up there? Why can't you get something done? Please solve a problem. And it hit me pretty early on. In my first about a couple of weeks in office, I was a newly elected member of Congress. I was 29 years old, right? Now I was going to take on the world. Being a CPA, the first thing I wanted to do, of course, is rewrite the tax code. And I wanted to protect the environment. I had all these big plans. And I realized right off the bat, though, that the parties were dividing us. Right? You get elected to Congress, they say, well, Patrick, look, you're a Democrat. We're going to put you over here in the room with all the other Democrats. And David, you're a Republican, so we'll put you over here with all the Republicans. You don't get to meet each other. But that was crazy. That doesn't make any sense. So I was fortunate enough to meet a freshman Republican member of Congress. And we went to dinner one night, and we started talking. And I realized that we actually agreed on more than we disagreed on, probably 80% of the issues. I said, what are we fighting about? Why don't we find something in common here and make some progress there? So we put forward some legislation that identified about $350 billion in wasteful, duplicative, fraudulent government spending, right? Vanilla stuff, something we should all want to do. And we're getting ready to introduce this bill, and my buddy comes to me and says, hey, Murph, listen, I need a couple weeks to do this. Something came up. Okay, I don't think anything of it. About 6 weeks goes by, and I bump into him at an event. I say, hey, what's going on? We're going to drop this legislation. I'm really excited. He says, I've been meaning to tell you, I'm not going to be able to do it with you. I said, why not? I mean, it's common sense stuff. I don't understand. He said, well, look, Speaker Boehner, who was the speaker at the time, found out that we were working on this together. And they are trying to beat you. The Republicans are trying to beat, me in the re-election, which was, again, 2 years from then. I just gotten elected. And we're going to spend millions of dollars to beat you. And if we do this bill, you're going to get a headline back home that says, Patrick Murphy cuts wasteful spending, and that would help you in your re-election. So, look, Murph, I'd love to do it, but the speaker said he'd drop me from my committee and block me from raising money. So, hey, maybe in 6 years from now, I'll be able to work with you on it. And I was like, holy cow, are you kidding me? This is remarkable that people are putting their party in their own election in front of the country. And I don't say that story off the bat to be partisan at all, because the Democrats did the same exact thing to David Jolly on some very important legislation. And so both parties are playing this game. And it's become toxic in D.C., as you have all witnessed. And I started really thinking about what's driving, this motivation. Why are things so broken? Why can't we get along? And we've sort of identified 7, 8, different structural problems that we feel have to be fixed before any of the subject matter gets addressed. Because if the foundation's not right, then nothing else is really going to work. So I'll just run through them real quick, and then hopefully we can have a little dialogue about it. First and foremost, I would say that gerrymandering is the single biggest problem we have in our country. I'll just get into it real quick on that one. 90% of congressional districts are predetermined. Right? 90% will be Republican or Democratic. So if you're in a safe, say, Democratic seat, the only election that really matters is that primary. Right? No Republican's ever going to beat you. You got to win a primary. And guess what the average turnout is in that primary? It's about 15%. Right? So you have 15% of the country determining 90% of your members of Congress. Right? And who do you think that 15% are? Typically, they lean more to the left or more to the right. So as a candidate or an elected official, you know exactly what you need to say and do to appeal to that 15%. So that drives most of the motivation of members of Congress. Then you add in the money, right, in the super PACs, right, and the billions of dollars being spent. Then you add in the third element, which is a more polarized media, both on TV, but certainly online and social media, ripping us apart, becoming more rigid. And then the lack of relationships in D.C. Members of Congress used to live there. They no longer do. We hardly know each other anymore, and that's a problem if you're talking about really tough issues. The cameras in every room all the time, having a camera on you. David and I always joke that D.C. is like, Hollywood for ugly people. Because they've all become actors. Because every time there's a camera, you're playing a part. And then the real discussion happens behind closed doors where there's no camera. Right? And then the last one I'll mention is the lack of earmarks, which used to provide some negotiating power, and the lack of regular order, which gave the new members and all members a voice. Right now it's top down. It's Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi dictating what we should be doing. So you put all that together, and this is what you get. And any single one of them would help fix it, but we're on a mission to try to address this and answer your questions. So I'll hand it over to David.
Thank you, Patrick. David.
Thank you, Patrick. Evan, thank you. Thank you to everybody who's spending some time with us to talk about what we think is not just an important conversation about the current challenges, but opportunities to fix them, to roll them back. Patrick mentioned he's a Democrat millennial who, if you haven't seen his socks, he's representing the Democratic millennial world.
I shouldn't be wearing socks, quite frankly. Millennials don't wear them.
I just noticed those socks. I'm wearing very staid Republican socks with a little bit of gray hair, so we're the yin and the yang to this. But we each had very similar experiences, and there are a couple foundational points for this conversation that I think are important. It's been said, but it is vitally important to each of our experiences and how they overlapped. Patrick was a Democrat who got elected and represented a Republican-leaning district. Myself, a Republican who was elected in a Democratic-leaning district that Obama had won twice. And that mattered because what informed our experience was the competitiveness between the parties within our own district, the diversity of our own constituency, which is very different than, as Patrick said, 90% of our colleagues who represent supermajority partisan seats where there is no inter-party competition. When I first ran for office, and this is another similarity we share, the first time we ran was for Congress. We didn't come up through a system that kind of refined our partisanship. We both ran for Congress as a very first run for public office. When I first ran, I had all the confidence and optimism in the world, and we got our first poll back, and it turned out I was polling at 1.5%. And the margin of error was 4. And it turned out to be a special election, so it was the only race in the country. If you remember, most recently there was the special election a year ago for John Ossoff and Karen Handel in Georgia that the whole eyes of the country kind of focused on. That was the type of race I was in, because it was a battleground race that the whole country, both parties wanted to fight over and see if they could win it. It became increasingly nasty and divisive, largely led by outside money through which I didn't have any control, nor did my opponent. We were being defined by outside groups whose only interest was the commodity of the congressional seat. It wasn't an interest in David Jolly or my opponent. It was this commodity swapping you see between the special interest groups. It got so nasty, some nights I had to call and make sure my mom was going to still vote for me, because the message out there on the street became so divisive that on election day, both my opponent and I ended up with favorability ratings that were upside down. But you finally get there and you're looking for the opportunity to really make a difference, as Patrick said. And where the curtain got pulled back, and when we talk about gerrymandering and a primary system that chokes off independence and chokes off the ability of inter-party voting, not to repeat all of those elements that Patrick raised, but what I would add to that, the layer to that I would ask you to think about, is how all of those structural challenges obscure and pervert the decision-making of our elected officials. So if you had the benefit of being in a 50-50 seat, of which only about 10% of members of Congress were, you woke up every day with the necessity, the political survival of thinking about all of your constituents in a competitive environment. For me, I had to think not just about Republicans, but also independents, also Democrats, to figure out what's the best voice of representation I can give to a divided community. That informed my decision-making. However, the other 90%, you wake up thinking about only your party. And not to take away the goodwill and the good intentions of our elected representatives, most, if not all, truly are in it for the right reasons, despite sometimes the questions we have for them. But their decision-making is informed only by their party alliance, because they represent a supermajority district. And in politics, like baseball, you don't have to bat 1,000. You don't have to get 100% of the vote. If you're a baseball player and you bat 300, you're a Hall of Famer. If you're a politician that can get to 51%, you can stay for life. So if 70% of your constituency is naturally only aligned with your party, you have the luxury of ignoring the 30% of minority political voices within your district. Similarly, if you're in a closed primary state, your pathway to re-election is only within your own party lane, not within a more diverse constituency. Consider how that informs the decision-making of members of Congress. And as we look at how it incentivizes gridlock, then consider the converse. Suppose we had a system where we had more 50-50 districts and open primary states, and how that informs decision-making. We would begin putting electoral rewards in front of our political actors for speaking in a bipartisan way, for trying to find bipartisan solutions. We would change the incentive structure. In any walk of life, you go to work hoping to keep your job, and you do the things that necessarily lead to you keeping your job. We have, through deliberate action of the past 30 years, so rigged this system to protect the political majority that accountability has been lost, and the incentives are there to continue down this hyperpartisan road. Compared to if we had a system where the incentives began to reward bipartisanship, we would see a complete change in political decision-making in Washington, D.C. I would close with this. Patrick and I often get branded as moderates. It may be a fair label, it may not be. I have people call me a rhino progressive. I have them call me a right-wing crazy. I have people call me a moderate. Political labels around ideology are in the eye of the beholder. Patrick and I have been on this tour for over a year now, and we're continuing it kind of out of our back pocket and through underwriting of some travel and hosts like BYU. We're doing it because there's still an appetite for where do we go next. And in offering where we go next, very importantly, nowhere in our suggestions are for people to reconsider their ideology. We're not suggesting that all the answers are in the middle. And very importantly, we always try to make sure that people understand we're talking about bipartisanship, not moderation of ideology. And those are two totally different things that in the national conversation we often conflate. Being a moderate is an ideology just like being a conservative or being a progressive. And wherever you are on that scale, God bless you, advocate for it, fight for the convictions you believe in to the right, left, or middle. What we are talking about is bipartisanship. Unrigging the system to create a level playing field where politicians and candidates get rewarded for speaking to each of those constituencies, for working together between each one of those constituencies, wherever it is you may fall. We look forward to this community conversation. We can't thank you enough for being here. The reason we're doing it is because, though it's not sexy and controversial what we talk about, it's not fire and fury. We're talking about academic issues to passionate frustrations. But because the communities across the country continue to turn out, we are optimistic that there is a third way ahead, or at least a third alternative for those who currently feel like they don't have voices in today's politics. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David and Patrick. That was great. Now, you know, you brought up the topic of party affiliation and partisanship, and both of you have very interesting stories when it comes to your own party affiliation that I think speaks to your commitment to issues and to serving the interests of your constituents, the interests of the country, above party, a novel concept, you know, country over party. We hear that a lot, and it's something I think we need more of, but you've both lived it. David, just about a month ago, you announced that even after having been a Republican, a lifelong Republican, I think I've heard you say that you're a Republican since you were old enough to vote and cast your first vote as a young man. And just a month ago, you've announced that you've left the party. Meanwhile, Patrick, you were a Republican. You were a supporter of Mitt Romney in 2008. Ultimately, I think left the Republican Party in 2011, and then challenged a Republican incumbent successfully, replacing him in Congress as a Democrat. And so I think it's, I would just like to hear from you, and I'd like our audience to hear from you about how you think about party affiliation. I mean, how does that factor into your leadership, to your approach to politics in the country? How should we think about party affiliation? What should drive that?
No, you go first. Lead with voting for Mitt Romney. It plays well in this room. But
Mitt Romney's a great guy. He's going to win here, right? He's going to win this election, right? It'll be interesting to see what he does after that, right? So for me, I was, I guess like a lot of people, when I was 18, 19, registered to vote, my dad is a Republican. My dad's my best friend and my mentor. So I was like, oh, if he's a Republican, I guess I am too. And that's how I registered. And that made a lot of sense. My first job was as an auditor at Deloitte & Touche, CPA. So I dealt with Sarbanes-Oxley a lot. If you all remember that legislation, I won't bore you, but it was as a result of Enron and WorldCom collapsing. So in my first job, I started seeing the intent of government versus the implementation of it, and there were two very different things. And I was frustrated. I didn't do a lot about it, though. Fast forward, 2010, BP oil spill happens. You all probably remember that. There was talk of this oil getting the loop current of the Gulf of Mexico, coming through the Florida Keys. That's where I'm from. Put together an oil skimming business to help clean up. And again, I saw government dysfunction, what I thought was borderline government cover-up. I thought we could have done a lot more, and I was really upset about it. Simultaneously, in 2010 was the start of the Tea Party movement. And here I am, a Republican, watching this movement, seeing the Tea Party that I thought was filled with a lot of hatred and anger. Regardless of the affiliation, I don't believe that's a way to solve a problem. Calling people names doesn't help get them to the table to see that, compromise there. And I started talking with some of my friends about, what I cared about. Maybe it was student debt, unemployment, the future of work, climate change, all these issues, saying, holy cow. These are issues going to affect my generation a lot more than my, parents and grandparents. We better get involved. And as a generation, we certainly were not and still aren't voting very much and certainly not running for office. So I said, forget it. Who am I to sit around and complain? And it kind of sounds silly, but I basically went through a list of about 25 issues, right? And I said, forget the stereotypes of Democrats and Republicans and whatever, because parties change, right? People change. We're seeing that in both parties right now, kind of an evolution. And I looked at these issues and I said, hey, I'm fiscally responsible, socially more progressive, and I felt comfortable changing parties because to me, I didn't have to change my story from a primary election to a general election. And had I stayed a Republican, I would have had to said things on a social stance that I didn't necessarily agree with, and then go back to the middle in a general election. And that's not who I am. And I said, hey, I'm going to be honest no matter what, because at the end of the day, you're never going to make everyone happy. Do what you think is best, right? There's always going to be 50% that are mad at you, and you want to sleep well at night, right? So I said, hey, I'm going to change parties, and not only that, I'm going to do something about it and run for office. And it is interesting to watch, though, because when I made that change in 2011 till today, 2018, both parties have changed quite a bit. And that's, I think, somewhat alarming to both of us. And David maybe will reflect a little bit more on that, but both seem to be becoming more tribal, right, and more to the extreme. It's going to be really interesting to watch how the next few years play out. And is there a third party? Do the two sort of moderates within those parties come together? Do they keep going more extreme? I'm not smart enough to figure it out, but it will be certainly interesting to watch.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick.
I would touch on a couple things. Patrick mentioned, and I fully agree, parties do evolve, and they kind of change over time. You see these ideological shifts, and I think what sneaks up on a lot of party members is it takes the long lens to realize that, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It's an evolution of a decade or 2 decades at times for parties to evolve, and we can study that through history. And sometimes it sneaks up on you, as it did with me, though kind of eyes wide open. I saw that evolution continue to occur, and I began to look at parties not as places where a pure ideology is parked and stays, but as shifting coalition of political voters. And if you begin to look at party affiliation as simply a coalition of ideologies, you necessarily need to find a place within that coalition, or that's not the party for you. Patrick and I very, very deliberately don't really talk partisan politics. We don't talk about politics. Even in today's environment, we try to stay away from political actors. But as a point of personal privilege on my own journey, it'll be hard to avoid some of the personalities. So forgive me for introducing some of that. I did become a Republican as soon as I was old enough to vote, and frankly, the debt and the deficit were kind of the number one issue. As I was coming of age, it was doctrine of the Republican Party, and it was less so of the Democratic Party. And I'm a fifth-generation Floridian who grew up as a preacher's kid in a very rural community, and I brought fairly religious, conservative perspectives as well, and I saw in the Republican Party an affiliation that made sense to me. Around the emergence of 2008, 2010 with the Tea Party, I kind of had this quixotic love affair because I saw these ideological convictions that I had first joined the party with that were being spoken to. Right? The emergence of the Tea Party largely was frustrated conservatives like myself who had not seen the advancements in a conservative economic ideology. But I also knew we were seeing the emergence of some tones and some actors and some themes that ran contrary both to what I saw as American principles, but to religious principles as well, to certain attitudes that I thought we should bring to all walks of life, including our politics. I struggled with it, but it was a dating relationship where you accepted the good and the bad, and for me, and this is where I inject something we typically don't talk about, it was the emergence of Mr. Trump. And from the very beginning, as a Republican, it was simply not a leader I could accept for the party nor for the country, and made that known as a sitting Republican member of Congress, perhaps when my colleagues would not. And as others of my colleagues fell in line, I never did. And I continued to give voice to my convictions about what the party should look like, but what the country should look like as well. It obviously created a journey away from the party. And for a couple of years, I stayed on message that the way to be a good Republican and fight for the party's values that I believe we should represent, we should primary President Trump in 2020, and I put my effort into that narrative. My wife and I, though, recently learned we're expecting our first child. And you naturally revisit your associations, from your church affiliations to your civic affiliations to your political affiliations. And it was at that moment she and I both decided to leave the party. And on the left, people say, you waited too late. Why'd you wait so long? And on the right, they say, oh, you were always a rhino anyway. I say this: I want our daughter to know that for 3 years we stood and fought, we stayed and fought for the convictions that we believed were important. But I also want our daughter to know that perhaps through our example, there are certain fights that wiser women and men walk away from. And this is a fight we've decided to walk away from. Others within the party can continue that fight. I'm excited about, as Patrick referenced, the emergence, and you are living proof of this emergence, of kind of a third lane of this restless, independent middle that can't quite find a home in these coalitions of ideologies that are presented by both major parties. What I didn't expect, and I'd close with this, in leaving the party, was the relief I felt in rejecting partisanship. You know, people say, well, you joined the Democratic Party. No, not a chance. I'm not leaving one bad relationship for another one.
Yeah.
I'm actually breathing easier now, and it's refreshing. And it's refreshing because I think I'm living in a space that a lot of us are, where we're looking for what's next.
That's great. Appreciate that from both of you. You know, Patrick, you both mentioned gerrymandering. I know it's an issue that both of you care a lot about, and that both of you think is key to fixing this polarized, dysfunctional, chaotic environment. But maybe you could help us understand exactly what we're talking about when we talk about gerrymandering. What is that? How does it happen? What's the process? What are the forces there are? I think that would be instructive for many of us here to sort of understand it at a deeper level. Patrick, why don't you start?
Sure. And so Dave and I get this question a lot. They say, guys, you know, gerrymandering's always been there. There's always been money. There's always been some aspect of media. These things have always been around. What are you talking about? That's true. But they've all gotten a lot worse recently, and especially in the last 10 years. So specific to gerrymandering, right, this dates back to Governor Gerry in Massachusetts in the 1800s. This has been going on. And quite simply what that is manipulating the lines of a particular district to favor one party or another. And both parties are guilty of this. Again, right? I mean, Dave and I don't talk about money and gerrymandering and media as if it's only one party guilty. They both do it. In this particular case, Republicans have done a better job of gerrymandering, though, right? In large part dating back to '94 with Newt Gingrich and kind of, you know, when Republicans got the majority there, starting to figure out it wasn't just the House and the Senate. You need to get to the state level, and you start, you know, getting those folks elected there so you can get more favorable lines drawn to help certain people out. Then you add in technology and computers, where with pretty good certainty, you can look at the magazines that people read, right, and the websites that they go to, and where they were born, and how many kids they have, and all these, you know, data points, put into an algorithm, and figure out with pretty good certainty how you're going to vote. And a computer does it instantly. So the states are drawing these districts really, really precisely right now, and that keeps getting more and more advanced. And what you're seeing now are these districts that have really been manipulated, and members of Congress that otherwise aren't as partisan as you know, you all think perhaps, are stuck kind of playing a role. I'll tell a quick story maybe. So I was 2013, just been elected to Congress, and had an opportunity to go to Afghanistan for Memorial Day. And Michelle Bachmann was leading that trip. You all might remember Michelle Bachmann. She was one of the leaders of the Tea Party. Politically, I didn't think we would agree on anything. I don't know. But I decided to go on this trip with her. I thought it would be a great opportunity to go to Afghanistan and see our brave men and women for Memorial Day. So I kind of went in like almost rolling my eyes, right, admittedly so. But we're on this trip for 3-4 days. And, I mean, she couldn't have been a nicer lady, right? She couldn't have been more humble. and soft-spoken and let the other members of Congress ask questions. Her questions were great. She carried her own luggage. I mean, all these little things were, we got along really well. And we're flying back, from Afghanistan, a long flight, and we're watching this movie with Nicolas Cage. I got to figure the name of this movie out. I think it's called 9/11, where he was a firefighter and the buildings collapsed. They thought he died. He ended up living. It was a really sad movie, right? You almost have to cry. So here I am, she's crying next to me. I pull out my handkerchief, I'm, wiping her tears, and I'm like, no one's ever gonna believe this story. Here I am, I just beat, one of these Tea Party leaders, and here I am, wiping the tears of another Tea Party leader. So it was crazy. I'm like, wow, what an experience. So we get back to DC, and we go to do like a little press conference about sort of like the lessons learned and things that we need to do in Afghanistan to improve the situation. And I, my talking points, I'm ready to go. And she goes first. And right off the bat, Barack Obama's the worst president ever, and the Democrats are killing us, and we're all going to die, and this and that, and just all these, comments about how bad the trip was and Democrats were. And I'm like, holy cow. I mean, I was just going to say all these nice things about you. And now I can't really. I mean, it's kind of a tough position. And it hit me then that that's not really who she was. But she was playing a part to a certain political base, whether that was the gerrymandered district that she was in and that 15%, right, that I mentioned earlier that were going to vote in that primary, or the group of people that were supporting her campaign, right, the donor base there where that energy was, and or the media. Because the truth is, the more outspoken you are, the more you're going to be on Fox, or the more you're going to be on MSNBC. And the more you're on TV, the more money you can raise because the more exposure you have. And then when you send an email out, more people are reading it, so then you raise more money there. And when you go to a new city that you've never been to, people say, oh, that guy Evan, I see that guy on TV all the time. Yeah, I'm going to go see him. Right? And what's that old saying in the press? Right? They don't report the plane that lands on time. So sometimes what David and I do is kind of boring. I'm impressed there's more than 2 people here, actually. It's kind of nice. But the extremes are dominating in all these ways. So to your question there, all these things work together. And that gerrymandering has created people and figures that oftentimes aren't who you think they are. And I don't use Michelle Bachmann as an example, just for Republicans. Democrats are equally guilty, right? I mean, all parties are doing this.
Yeah, so that's great, Patrick. And David, maybe you could pick up with that. So let's say, that you're considering running for office and you live in one of these districts that's been drawn in such a way that Patrick described so that it's a guaranteed win for the Democrats or the Republicans. And let's say it's a Republican district, and let's say you're a Republican. And so you're considering running for office in this district. Step us through as that person. What's that person's experience as they decide to run for office, as they decide what their messaging is, as they decide what their policy positions are? Then they get to Congress to try to govern. And I'm a believer that most people who start down this path do it because they want to serve the country. They have the best interests of the country and their constituents in mind. They want to make a difference. But just step us through. Like, imagine you're that person. What happens to you over time because of this guaranteed Republican or Democratic district?
So you get into it with independence of thought, right? I mean, I've always thought, particularly as first-time candidate, we need more investments in vocational education, more alternatives to, say, the 4-year university track. It has both an economic growth component, but also can really transform people's lives that need that type of track. The reality is you're a Republican candidate, so you talk about building the wall, repealing Obamacare, and whatever the other issue is that is in that echo chamber of the hard right, because that's what's resonating in that district that's been drawn for you. An example for me, because it was such a hyper-partisan race in my first race, we got defined by the outside money. My race was $14 million. I only raised 1.4 of that. So if you consider all the outside money that's uncoordinated, that's being used to define David Jolly, both for the pro and the con, I came out of that race looking to the right of Allen West in voters' minds. They thought, this Jolly, he is as far right as you can go, because that's where the politics drove me with the outside money, even that's not who I was. Understand, as a preacher's kid, religious conservative, I believe the teachings of my faith instruct traditional marriage. But as I read the Constitution, I believe in equality of all marriages and all faiths and for people to define their own relationships. And so as I stepped out on that issue, in the voters' minds, I had been identified through them as a strict religious conservative, pro-traditional marriage, ban marriage equality in states across the country. As I arrived, Florida was having this debate and the court systems were wrestling with it. And I was a Republican that publicly expressed support for marriage equality. And the whiplash among that hyper-conservative, the super-conservative community, they abandoned me because they thought that I had abandoned them, right? And understandably so, because in their mind, they thought I was of one persuasion when in fact I was of another. Conversely, a colleague of mine in the Republican delegation, who today believes in marriage equality, was elected in '06 on a campaign against marriage equality. And he has never publicly changed his position. And he pulled me aside and said, listen, I agree with you on the equality issue, but when I first ran 12 years ago, I said that I would be opposed to it, and I feel like I have a duty to honor that commitment to my constituencies. I don't know that either one of our situations was necessarily wrong, right? They're just different choices of political representation that then ultimately voters get to evaluate and make a decision. On the quick civics point on gerrymandering, though, because Patrick touched on it, and it's important if you leave today, you understand what's happened with gerrymandering. District lines are drawn at the state level by state capitals, not by the Congress. And typically they are drawn by political actors in the state legislature. But we are seeing movements across the country where voters are saying, we want to change our state constitution and either create independent district commissions, remove it from the politicians, or if politicians are going to draw it, in Florida, they put new criteria on saying, we want geographically compact district. And legislators, if you don't do this, the courts are going to invalidate it. Eric Holder and Arnold Schwarzenegger on this national campaign for gerrymandering reform. Throw in that reforms for primary systems that are also happening at the state level. They don't happen in Washington. Utah is in an experimental bed right now, just like many other states. We're living through a decade of these relatively radical reforms where we don't quite have the data back that's conclusive. You know, a top two system in California, the data doesn't really translate to a purple state like Florida. Ranked choice voting in Maine is new. We don't quite have the data back. But we're living in a time where that data is emerging and it's good and it's healthy. We leave that as a civics lesson because do think about that. Just as you get behind political candidates each November or political causes, consider some of these reforms and whether or not you think the system would create greater accountability if we put our collective efforts into some of these reforms.
David, could you explain a little more, just explain the California system and ranked choice voting, what that actually is and what kind of impact, you know, some of those reforms could have? I mean,
Sure.
Explain what those things are, if you would.
So California moved to a top two primary system that says regardless of your party, the top two candidates in the primary move to November. What we've seen in California is more often than not, it's two Democrats that move to November. And in many ways, that reflects kind of the deep blue politics of the state of California. And it's choked off some of the Republicans, but it's done so out of popular vote, if you will. In Maine, instead of just a binary choice of, I'm going to vote for this person, you have multiple candidates and you rank them. This is my order of priority among 5 candidates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they collect almost through a point system who moves on to the next round. In gerrymandering reform, there's a fair districts movement that says we want all our district lines to be geographically compact. That geography could certainly be a test of fairness. We cautioned in Florida when we did that, it actually kicked out the 4 moderates, myself included. My district went from an Obama +2 to Obama plus about 12, and it was no longer competitiveness. So one thing we talk about, not as an endorsement, but as a proposal to consider, suppose a gerrymandering reform initiative where we said we want district lines to be drawn as electorally competitive as possible. Define fairness by the need to compete. We're not going to get all districts 50-50. You know, deep in Texas, there's a an R plus 46 district. Somewhere in Manhattan, there's a D plus 42. We're not going to change the natural constituencies, if you will, but you could create about 70% of the districts in Congress being 50-50. Imagine the product we would see coming out of Congress if a majority of members of Congress truly had to be responsive and look for bipartisan solutions on every issue.
Yeah, that's great. And Patrick, you have thoughts on that, I know. But in addition to those, could you help us understand, again, you're the candidate, put us in the mind of the candidate who is running for office in a ranked choice voting scenario. How does that impact the way you run? How does that impact who you try to address, who you try to serve, who you try to meet? What's the impact there?
Well, in both cases, in Maine with the ranked choice and in California with the top two, what it's doing is kind of drawing you to want a broader base of people. With that ranked choice, you want to be, of course, everyone's number one, but you want to be their 2 and 3 and 4 as well. If there's 10 candidates, you want to be at the top of the list at least. And do everything you can to not just get a small segment, but a broader segment. And what it's doing in California, in the case, just say there's 2 Democrats that move on.